Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers. I'm looking at this book, the TRIPS Agreement. This is actually the book itself. It's a big book, again. It's got 750 odd pages. It's a substantial work. You can probably see it here if I open it up. You can see the various bits. It has nice paragraph numbers on the sides. It has a massive number of appendices at the back. And it's actually a heavy book. You can probably see from that the detail that is taken from some of the main agreements that we're actually talking about in this book. The actual book itself is called the TRIPS Agreement, Drafting History and Analysis. It's now in its third edition by Daniel Gervais, and it's published by Sweet and Maxwell. I'll leave it there so you can have a look at it. I've also got the flyer, which is quite interesting. Nice picture there of various things. I'm going to talk about the book in a little bit of detail. You can see from the inside what it's actually got, a whole range of very detailed information about what is actually a very complex area. Anyway, I'm going to have a little look at it, and I'll talk in a bit more detail about what we've got here with this book. The title that I've given the review on the internet is "There's No Trip Up on IP Matters Here," because in fact what the author has done, he's been able to produce a work which tries to explain the intricacies of what is frankly a very boring area and a very confusing area of law. And what we need to do is really have a look at what we're talking about here. You may already know this, but in fact it needs to be reminded, perhaps, for some to forget, that TRIPS means the following: trade-related aspects of international property rights. So we're looking at IP, we're looking internationally at IP, and we're looking at the trade implications. So you can see it's an important area, and of course there's a lot of money involved. As Gervais attests in this very thorough and detailed guide, it aims to provide a complete set of tools to understand the unique mixture of trade rules and intellectual property concepts which we know as TRIPS and the TRIPS Agreement. Part 1 of the book, and the book's split into various parts, provides the necessary background for understanding the TRIPS Agreement itself, whose birth, says Gervais, was quite unlike any other agreement in the field of intellectual property. And obviously, as you will know, there are plenty of other agreements which of course are referred to in this book. The reader's guided through, I think, nicely with the emergence and the evolution of the TRIPS Agreement, and it gives you an understanding of why and how it happened in the framework of what we know as a General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, the GATT agreements. So the TRIPS Agreement is an international agreement on intellectual property which covers in fact any aspect of law that you're actually likely to find in this area. And the author points out that TRIPS is one of the most significant milestones in the development of IP in the 20th century, and perhaps more importantly than its broad coverage, of course, the TRIPS Agreement has enshrined detailed rules on one of the most difficult and, for rights holders, the most painful aspect of intellectual property rights, which is actually enforcement. We all know about that, obviously, from the internet. Let's look at it in a bit more detail. Gervais himself is an international expert on the subject, professor of law at and director of the IP program at Vanderbilt University, and he's got a whole range of other massive qualifications that makes him eminently suited to write this work. What we've got after part 1 of the book, which is the general stuff, is we've got part 2, which examines the detail, and it looks at the provisions of the TRIPS Agreement itself. It analyses all aspects of the agreement, taking first the general provisions and basic principles, and then later on in part 2 it looks at standards concerning availability, scope and use of intellectual property rights in a whole range of areas, and these areas are actually quite important: copyright, trademarks, geographical indications, industrial design, patents and so forth. The third section in part 2 then goes on to deal with the quite often vexed question of enforcement of IP rights, including civil proceedings, administrative proceedings, and also looks at the remedies and any criminal procedures that might be involved. And there are various categories of enforcement which are detailed in the extremely thorough treatment which Gervais gives of what is a complex and actually continuing emerging area of law. It's a difficult one, and as you know, with the internet generally, there are a lot of problems which will need to be ironed out this century. Part 3, which we then go on to, contains no less than 13 annexes right at the back, and they're very detailed, you saw them a little earlier, of relevant documentation pertaining to TRIPS. And this is all the, actually, if you like, it's the backup material that you might need depending on what sort of problem you've got to deal with. There's a useful table of relevant WTO cases, that's the World Trade Organization cases, and he's inserted, of course, a massive bibliography which will probably be very useful to academics. I don't know how useful it's actually going to be to us, but it's 60 pages of bibliography with documents, books and so forth. And there's copious research material, obviously, which was used to produce the current edition. So if you're an IP practitioner, or an academic, a legal researcher, or a trainee even, you need this book. It really does actually contain everything you could possibly need to know about TRIPS. And reputedly, it saves you the bother entangling yourself in multiple articles and downloads on the subject, of which there are many, as I'm sure you are well aware. Certainly, it's an invaluable work of reference, and I hope it will be of assistance to you with any of your intellectual property matters. So as I said before, you're not going to trip up if you use this one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.